Reconstruction era. Last month we looked at Reconstruction just after the Civil War, so we're going to pick up kind of where I left off on that. So here is a map of Suwannee County in 1877, which basically is as Reconstruction ends in not just Florida, but in the entire country, mainly the South, of course. But 1877, you see that Live Oak in the center is now the county seat of Suwannee County and shown as the county seat. You have several communities, some of which were on earlier maps I've been showing you. But there's newer places like Wellborn, Suwannee at the top, which is close to Suwannee Springs. It was called Suwannee also. Columbus has been renamed to Ellaville, but the post office is still Columbus Post Office. So you lived in Ellaville, but it was sent to the Columbus Post Office. But that would change back and forth a few times over the next few decades. You have nothing showing in the south part of Suwannee County, although by this point we do have lots of people living there. Just no communities at this time. We had some prior to this. I talked about, I think, last month or the month before, when we talked about the county seat relocation, that there were some communities prior to this point, but as of this map, they're no longer showing. Places like Plowdens and whatnot, and New Boston. So, last month we talked about, again, the end of Reconstruction, and as part of that change in Florida, we've got Governor George Franklin Drew being come in. He lives on the Madison County side of the Suwannee River, just where the Suwannee River State Park is. He had a mansion there. We talked about him again last month. But he becomes governor of Florida, serves one term. Let's see, that's his portrait there in Tallahassee. We talked about that election of 1876, how Samuel Tilden actually had more votes, not only electoral votes, but popular votes. But as part of that compromise, folks decided, okay, we are going to allow Reconstruction to end in exchange for having somebody else become president. So that's why we don't have President Tilden in our list of presidents. We have Hayes instead, which nobody really knows much about him. Not one of those you can think of, oh, this is what he did good for the country. Might have been a nice guy, but he really couldn't do much because of this era that he found himself in. So, moving on past that, 1878, we have Live Oak, a community that had been established by 1861. That's the earliest record I can find of it anyway. When at that time it was Live Oak Station, one of the stops on the railroad. Well, in 1878, a group of 39 men get together and incorporate the town, April 24 specifically. It encompassed 960 acres, just a little over a square mile, and that was the original town of Live Oak. A few things that they did, they created a seal similar to this. This is the current one, very similar to this, but this one's got a lot more than what the other one had. But basically it had the live oak tree and the words Live Oak, Florida on the bottom of it. And then they created a government. And that government was made up of the mayor, Major A.L. Woodward, and he had the town council of H.A. Blackburn, H.M. Wood, C.K. Dutton, Major H.A. Wise, and Thomas Thompson. So those are the first town council and aldermen, sometimes they were called, of the town of Live Oak. Also, S.W. Hicks was the town sheriff and the tax collector. So he did double duty under that. So that was basically the first day, April 24th. The next day, they came back to hold their first official meeting, and they basically passed a few laws. Let's see, 5 ordinances. One of them was fighting profanity. You couldn't use profanity or you'd get sued or fined. You had prohibited shops and establishments from opening on Sundays, so nothing was open on Sundays. You couldn't park your mules or horses on the paths or sidewalks. So even back then there were parking issues. And let's see, this one I love. They punished those who might, quote, needlessly hammer pots at hours when slumber should have been the order of the day. In other words, don't be banging around late at night when people are trying to sleep. So those they passed, and then they adjourned the meeting. So that was basically the first official meeting of the town government of Live Oak. That was Live Oak that was established as a town, no longer just established as a community, but a town with government in 1878. And Live Oak continued to grow, as we talked about, I believe, last month, that for some time it was the only railroad link into Florida. If you wanted to come by railroad, you would come through Live, which allowed Live Oak to grow. And not just Live Oak, but the entire county. Our population in 1880 was 7,161, which was nearly twice as much as it had been in 1870. So population is growing as more people come in. So the railroad, no longer being the only railroad in Florida, but it comes through Live Oak. And again, as more and more people are moving in, you've got to have more and more schools. This was not an era of huge schools like we have today. It was 1-, 2-room schools, first grade through 12th grade, if you got that high. A lot of people didn't. But you had those 1-room schoolhouses. So in 1879, there were 28 schools in Suwannee County, but 2 years later, 1881, we had 49. So the number of schools in Suwannee County doubled in a 2-year period. So that's how many people are moving in to Suwannee County. Salary increases for the teachers also. They went to between $15 and $25. Yay. Better than it was. Some other improvements as we go through Live Oak during this period. In 1884, an artesian well is built or installed close to downtown Live Oak, and that basically allows a lot more people to be drinking water from that well. Up until that point, people were using cisterns in their house or other things that were not so good, that would, individual wells that would dry up. It was nothing that they wanted to have. So they had a cistern installed basically on, I think it's Ohio and Howard, right there at the corner, southwest corner, so southwest. So basically where Rhett Bullard's office and the public defender's office, right there in that area, is where that cistern was installed in 1884. Now when they built that artesian well, that allowed them to drain some of these swampy ponds that had been around Live Oak that were causing malaria and other issues. And if you recall, I talked about John Parsley, who basically established downtown Live Oak as we know it, that he probably died from malaria. So getting rid of some of these ponds hopefully helped the overall health of the community. Looking at the map again. 1884 also we had at least three newspapers that I know of in Suwannee County. They were the Florida Baptist, the Florida Bulletin, and the Florida Intelligencer. So several newspapers, all these were based in Live Oak. This map actually is a map of Live Oak from 1885. Lots of improvements have been made. This is what's called a Sanborn insurance map. I've got several years worth. They are very helpful in researching locations of buildings and houses and whatnot. It's something that I can't just send to you or hand out to you because the owners don't like to do that. But I can tell you a few things about it. North is more or less down here, this direction. So here's the railroads. The current railroad that we have today follows this line. Here's Connor Street, Ohio, Howard. You can see several streets. Yellow buildings are those that are made out of wood. So as you see, most structures in Live Oak, even at this point, 25 years after the community was established, are made of wood. But then you see red, those are brick. And those three red brick buildings that's the Ethel Hotel or the Ethel House, which was a hotel right across from the railroad depot, very handy. You also have over on the right-hand side, the lower brick one, was the old Dexter store. That building burned in, I believe, the 1930s, and they partially restored it to a one-story building. It was a two-story building. And for many years, it was part of Winn-Dixie, when Winn-Dixie was in downtown Live Oak. It's right now that nobody's using it. And then the top red building is the offices of Rhett Bullard and the Public Defender's Office, which, as far as I can tell, was probably the first, if not the first, one of the first brick buildings built in Live Oak. So that building that they still are in is 130 years old, almost 140 years old now. So that shows downtown Live Oak. The funny thing is, with this insurance map, this is the only map of Live Oak in there. Now, as you get into later years in the Sanborn maps, well, I'll show you bits and pieces of them over the years as we go through those lessons. But back in the, say, 1910, 1912, they had 15 or 16 maps showing Live Oak. 1880, 1885, 1890, they've got all of one map showing downtown Live Oak. They don't even go out as far as the courthouse. What they do is they have a notation up there on the top says 270 feet this direction is a two-story wooden courthouse. So they're not even showing what we consider downtown Live Oak today, but that was the original, well, post-Civil War downtown Live Oak. So, not much, but you can see a lot of businesses. A lot of businesses over here. This was called the Palace Block at this point. Several businesses over here, which would be north of the railroad tracks. So very interesting, because sometimes they will actually name the houses or the buildings. Like this one is called the Slate House. It's Hamilton Street and whatnot. Yeah, lots of different things. So it's very helpful for me as a historian and a researcher to look this stuff up. On my computer, I've taken these maps for these various years and inserted information from city council minutes, county commission records, newspapers, that help me so I can pull up and say, all right, this building was bought by this person and sold to this person, known as this, et cetera, et cetera. Very helpful. There's the Florida Institute, which was where the old hospital was, the school for African American kids. So, lots of interesting information just on this one little map. Moving on, 1886, this shows a map of Suwannee County. As you can see, there are a few more communities, places like Middleton, which, depending on the map, was either in Suwannee County or in Lafayette County. This one shows it as a dot in Lafayette County, but other ones I've got show Suwannee County. You've got Wilson down south of Welborn, which is misspelled. You've got Rixford north of Live Oak, and that's where Rixford Road is today. I don't know what the number is, but halfway between Live Oak and Suwannee Springs. So different communities are popping up. Actually, Middleton's showing right there, sorry, wrong dot. Middleton is halfway down. At this point, we've got 18 post offices in Suwannee County, so this is not even all-inclusive list of the communities that have post offices. Let's see, 1885, 1886, the federal government, who had reserved a lot of the timber in Suwannee County, they basically opened it up for sale, which brings more people into Suwannee County. So now you can buy up lots of timber, you can start building more sawmills, clearing the land, and then selling them for homes. This map actually shows Rollins Bluff down here, which would later become Branford. So more and more people are moving in. That other map I just showed you of Live Oak, here's a zoomed in portion showing the Ethel House, along with part of the old freight depot over there, freight platform. See, it has cisterns, the Ethel Hotel, and this is the old Ethel Hotel. I'll get it out in a minute. In 1885, they built the brick portion. This red portion here was newly built. I've got a newspaper at my office from 1885 that says the newly built brick portion. And so it supplemented and then replaced the old portion, which was made out of wood, that says old up here. Ethel House, and it's another two-story house. So that Ethel House had been around under various names for many years. It was owned, it looks like, by the Connor family, which we talked about a month or two ago. Mr. Connor, who was a clerk of court, who was a businessman, who was a preacher, who was a blackmailer, and the guy who could not move the courthouse very well. That guy, he and his family owned that property. Nancy partially either bought it or took it over in the 1880s, during this period we're looking at. But she didn't keep it long. She sold it to, I don't remember who it was, she sold it to a succession of folks. And it was used for many years. It was a very popular place for, up until the Suwannee Hotel was built in the early 1900s. This was pretty much the hotel to go to in Live Oak. Unfortunately, in 1915, it burned down. And not only did it burn itself down, but it took out a lot of the surrounding businesses. And I found that from one of the newspaper articles. Unfortunate. And you can see one reason why it's popular, because it's right across from the freight platform, the railroad. You get off the railroad, there 60 feet away, right across from it is, there we go, there's the hotel, a nice brick hotel to stop at. This is a picture taken between 1897 and 1903 from the water tower, the old water tower, the Dowling Water Tower. And you can see here's the freight buildings that we were just looking at. There's the Ethel Hotel, right there behind all those trees. And you can see several other buildings. Again, you see the several railroads that came through also. So I love this picture. I love it. I wish there's more detail back this way. I mean, the courthouse would be, I mean, it's possible that's the courthouse. It's hard to tell from the angle, but that could be the old wooden courthouse before we built the 1904 one. Yeah, here's Ohio Avenue, so you can see some of these buildings, some of which still exist in this era. So I love this picture. This is a picture of the Ethel Hotel in 1908, part of a article, I guess you could say, an article that was put out by what would later be called the Chamber of Commerce. I think it was called the Board of Trade. But that shows the brick portion of it. By then it was 20-something years old. The nice live oak trees that you can see there too. So, you know, beautiful for the time, nice. Kind of small for what we'd say today, but back then that was live oak, that was good stuff. All right, other things going on. Steamboats. We talked briefly about them last month. One or two have started coming back on the Suwannee River after the Civil War. The 1880s starts the heyday, really, of steamboats on the Suwannee River. This is not a picture of the Erie. I don't have a picture of the steamboat Erie. This is the Belle of Suwannee. But the Erie was one of those that came on in the 1870s, late 1870s and early 1880s. She was built in Jacksonville in 1876. She was 34 tons, so a very small steamboat on the river, 70 feet long, 21 feet wide. She had 3 officers, 12 men, and carried passengers from time to time, but mainly she was a cargo carrier. So not so much in the way of people, but more of cargo. She moved to Cedar Key in 1880. She was owned by a group of merchants on the Suwannee River, including some in Suwannee County, and she stayed for about 3 years or 4 years, and then was sold to Manatee County, or people down in Manatee County. So she was there. Henry Plant, one of the 2 Henrys that you learn about, the 2 main Henrys you learn about in Florida from the late 1800s and early 1900s, the other being Henry who? Flagler. Henry Flagler, there we go. Henry Plant, Henry Flagler. Big wigs in establishing Florida as a tourist destination by their infrastructure that they put in, by railroads, steamboats, hotels, you name it, bring it in. So Henry Plant was kind of the first of those, really. He was born in 1819 in a place called Branford, Connecticut. His family wanted him to be a preacher. He didn't. Instead, he became a captain's boy on a steamboat and like a deckhand, and kind of worked his way up, became a jack of all trades, learning all kinds of stuff about steamboats, about machinery, things like that. So he did that for many years, and eventually took over a company that sold and delivered parcels, kind of like the predecessor to the FedEx or one of those kinds of things. He had a company like that he took over. He made a lot of money. In 1853, his wife's health got worse, and like a lot of people at that time, they were told, hey, you need to move down south. Stop being up here up north, move down south, get away from those cold winters. And he stayed several months in Jacksonville, and that kind of gave him some ideas for the future of, hey, this is a spot ripe for investment. And so he did that a little bit. Now, in 1861, as he saw the Civil War approaching, like other people did, he basically bought out portions of the Southern Express Company and started delivering packages that way during the Civil War. So he did it throughout the Civil War, made a lot of money, so much so that by the end of the Civil War, he had enough money in his pockets to buy up several railroads that were being foreclosed upon or that had issues financially because of the Civil War, what had happened through that. So he started buying up these railroads piecemeal, piece by piece. 1882, he established the Plant Investment Company, and Henry Flagler was involved a little bit of that too, and some others were working on that. So within 15 years, he was one of the richest men in the United States, i.e. probably one of the richest men in the world at this point. Lots of money. Railroad service. Up until he moved into the area and started doing stuff, the railroad coming from Georgia stopped at Live Oak. He decided to let me extend it further south to get more into the rest of Florida. And so he started building that railroad. Now, his intention was to build that railroad from Live Oak down to Cedar Key, which Cedar Key had been the terminal of the old Florida Railway, which had been built by David Levy Yulee, who had been a senator and stuff prior to Civil War. So it went from Cedar Key to Fernandina Beach, and Mr. Plant wanted to build it from Live Oak to Cedar Key. Go ahead and kind of use some of the stuff that's already there. Well, the people down in Cedar Key didn't want to sell him that building. And so he said, all right, forget y'all. I'm going to go to this place called Tampa instead. I'm going to build my railroad down there. So that's what he did. So he helped to build up Tampa by getting them railroad access. Plus he built a huge hotel called the Tampa Bay Hotel. It's now part of the University of Tampa. So he built a huge hotel, nice hotel, kind of like Flagler would do also. I mean, Plant did it too. They both were doing it. And that helped to grow Tampa. It was already a good-sized town or city, but he helped to increase it, multiply its size by giving it railroad access and these amenities that they didn't otherwise have. So he did that. One thing about him was he had a good friend. His friend was named Robert Ivy. Robert Ivy of Suwannee County. So because of that, we have Robert Ivy and some of his relatives live in the south part of the county. They're operating a ferry at a place called Rollins Bluff. Well, Mr. Ivy decides, hey, let me establish this community, or re-establish the community. And instead of calling this area Rollins Bluff, let's call it after my friend Henry Plant's hometown of Branford. But it's not Branford, it's New Branford. So let me call this place New Branford. And that's what he did. He called it New Branford. Over the years, it changed to just Branford. So we have Branford indirectly because of Henry Plant, named after his hometown. So Branford, Connecticut, Branford, Live Oak, Branford, Suwannee County. So after Plant died, his railroad holdings especially, went into the Atlantic coastline and became CSX over the years, and now it's part of the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad. So they're still kind of a successor railroad to what he owned late 1800s, early 1900s. Man had a lot of money. Thousands of miles of railroad pretty much by the time he died. So Henry Plant. But not only, again, did he do railroads, he also did hotels. But not only hotels, he also did steamboats. Oh, there we go. Steamboats. The first steamboat he brought onto the Suwannee River was the Caddo Belle, which began operations in 1883, July specifically. She was built in Ohio in 1880. She was a bigger one, 125 feet long. Bigger than the Erie that had been on here at this point. She'd haul freight on the lower deck and passengers on the second deck, sometimes third deck if they had them. And then what she would do is she would connect to that railroad that had just been built by Mr. Plant. She'd connect to Branford and Cedar Key, Branford, come up a little bit more upriver and stuff. So she was able to transport passengers and cargo that way. Very helpful. She was not really successful on the Suwannee River, the Caddo Belle. And so she was moved over to Columbus, Georgia, I believe in 1884. And within a year, she was declared unfit for service and was laid up. Kind of had a checkered past. I think her captain committed suicide and things like that. So not so good. But by the time Caddo Belle is leaving the Suwannee River, there's another steamboat on the Suwannee River called the Bertha Lee. Kind of about the same size, 130 feet long. Caddo Belle was 125, and actually that's the Bertha Lee there. But looked very similar. Bertha Lee's 5 feet longer. And tonnage, let's see, 121 tons compared to 167 tons. So I mean, they were kind of similar size. Now the Bertha Lee was built up north in, I believe, Ohio. Yeah, on the Ohio River, 1879. And she was transferred by the Mississippi River to Central Florida, down around Fort Myers in that area. So what happened was they wanted to sell her on the Kissimmee River, use her as a steamboat on the Kissimmee River. And so they got there, but there was a little bit of a problem because there were a lot of connecting lakes on the Kissimmee River. And what they tried to do was to get from one to the other, from Fort Myers to Kissimmee, and there was an issue because of water levels were very low. So there's this interesting story, if you search far enough you can find it, or search long enough you can find this discussion of the Bertha Lee's 53-day journey. They should have taken 3 or 4 days to go from Fort Myers to Kissimmee. You can drive it how long now? I don't know. Somebody tell me. A couple hours probably. Took them 53 days by steamboat because the water was so bad. She had lots of issues. She was big for that river. The water level was down. If you read through the stories, you find the crew had to get off the boat to dig their own channel to get to the next part because the water level was so low. Sometimes they would have to back the steamboat up and then use the stern wheel to churn up the dirt enough to make a slight, narrow channel for her to get through. It was terrible. They ran low on wood. They ran low on food. They started bartering with the Seminole Indians that lived in the area. So, it's one of those epic journeys that today we can drive in a couple hours probably, but it took them almost 2 months. So look it up when you have time. It's kind of fun to read. Well, she finally made it to where she needed to go, but her owners realized, you know what? She's not going to do well here on the Kissimmee River. So she was sold to the Suwannee River. Or eventually the Suwannee River, went to St. John's River, then the Suwannee River. And a guy by the name of Captain Benjamin Franklin Hall, Jr., was her captain. Now, he had been the one that captained her on that trip, that 53-day trip between Fort Myers and Kissimmee. Well, he continued to command her and then basically eventually owned her and moved her over to the Suwannee River in either late 1885 or early 1886 and started using her, again, passengers on the top, freight on the bottom. She sailed on the river for not a long period of time, but long enough for there to be advertisements showcasing, hey, come sail on the Bertha Lee on the Suwannee River. Eventually she got moved over to the Apalachicola River and went through Apalachicola, Chattahoochee River, that area. And poor Mr. Hall, he spent his life savings, which was $10,000 at the time, to totally refurbish the Bertha Lee, and then she ran aground and was wrecked. So he lost all his life savings. So he basically had to start from scratch again. He worked as a night clerk in a hotel, built his way back up, and eventually was able to buy and build several more steamboats in Central Florida. So, interesting story. This is the Bertha Lee in Columbus, Georgia. So, again, decent sized steamboat. Lots of bales of cotton at that point. Yeah, Benjamin Franklin Hall Jr., he was Irish descent. He was a Quaker, lived around Massachusetts and then Pittsburgh and then West Virginia. And again, he became a steamboat captain up north and then came down south and steamed on the Bertha Lee and owned the Bertha Lee. And then after she was wrecked, he rebuilt, like I just said, he rebuilt his savings and bought and built several more smaller steamboats down in Central Florida. So mid-1880s, this specific map is 1882, I believe, shows some of those railroads, and you can see in the darker black with the dots, that's part of the Savannah, Florida and Western Railway and its connections, and this became part of the plant system of railroads and other things, steamboats and whatnot. So you can see that. And here is that old Florida Railway I was talking about coming from Fernandina down to Cedar Key. And at this point, Mr. Plant has not continued building down to Branford or to Tampa, but this shows it just before that. So again, all these connections, that's what he owned right then, but he owned a lot more later on. But he was not the only railroad developer in Suwannee County. This is the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad, 1880s, early 1880s. And it was an act to incorporate the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad Company. These folks that are listed as the incorporators, people like John F. White, who I think I've mentioned, and I'll mention in a couple of months, but a prominent lawyer and judge. C.K. Dutton, Charles K. Dutton from New York, moved down here after the Civil War. He was big into the turpentine and timber industries. Henry M. Wood, H.M. Wood, he ran basically what became the Suwannee Democrat at one point, big in the newspapers. Henry S. Haynes, H.S. Haynes, probably where Haynes Street came from. Another big businessman, Henry A. Wise of New York, another gentleman that was into turpentine timber. He went into business with C.K. Dutton a lot, so very, very big wig there. R.A. Ivy, that's Robert A. Ivy. Joseph H. Ruff, I'm not quite sure who he is really. William Bryson Jr. was big into politics, and he owned some businesses too, so he was a big wig of the time. Washington L. Irvin, W.L. Irvin, the guy that established Louisville, named after his daughter, we'll talk about in a few minutes. D.M. McAlpin, Daniel M. McAlpin, he was also a newspaper guy who ran what became the Suwannee Democrat, and the guy for whom McAlpin is named. He was also a state, I believe, representative. C.R. King, William B. Taylor, those are also folks. William B. Taylor, I think, was a county commissioner and businessman. So moving and doing lots of things here in Suwannee County. One story, well, actually there's several stories. American Siberia, I think we've talked about this book before. Written in the early 1890s by a guy named John C. Powell, who ran the convict labor system, which was enacted after Reconstruction. And he writes a few stories about Suwannee County that are related to the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad. This one here we're talking about. Let's see. As it's nearing completion, he talks about a family from the woods of that area down around what's now Branford. They come out because they've heard about this thing called a train. They've never seen or heard one before, but they hear there's something out there. And so they come to Mr. Powell and they ask to kind of look at the railroad and stuff. So he points out, here's the railroad, whoop-de-doo. The engine's not there yet. He said, hey, just give it a few minutes and the engine will be back. So they kind of just plop themselves down and sit and wait. Really backwards type folks, you get the impression. And so they're just sitting and watching, and all of a sudden around the corner, there's some flat cars that are being pushed. So there's like, what's making this thing move? Because they're just used to horses and oxen and that kind of stuff. It's like, what's making these move? And then the engine comes around, and they freak out. They like jump up, and the patriarch of the family, everybody's kind of hold up, scared, holding him. Like, what is that? The iron horse is coming to get them, and they basically freak out and about to run away. Mr. Powell is able to calm them down a little bit, but then they quickly leave anyway. It scares them basically. They are freaked out by a train coming through, the smoke coming out. Their idea of Satan perhaps or something like that. It's kind of the impression you get in that book. So that's one of the funny stories about this railroad. Another point about the railroad, because convicts, I didn't mention this, the convicts are used to help build it. So not only was it businessmen paying people, but they also have leased out the convicts, state convicts, to help build this. So that's why it's mentioned in this book, because Mr. Powell was in charge of the convict camp system here. And another point, he's talking about an old settler. He doesn't mention the name that I can recall, but it's a guy that's been around for a long time in this area. And he gets subpoenaed to go to Jacksonville to court. He's a witness for a trial, and he's got to ride the train. Well, he's never been on a train. So Mr. Powell talks about him, and when he talks about when he gets put on the train, he starts to cry. This old, grown man starts to cry. And he basically says, I'm not a coward. I've faced death 1,000 times. I've killed more bears than I can remember, but I don't think I'm ever going to see my family again because I'm on this death contraption called a train. And it doesn't help when they actually start moving and they bump into another car to, couple it. So he's freaking out. He's wanting to get off the train. And they finally are able to get him calmed down and take him over. And I think the story goes that after that point, he was a frequent rider. He got over his fear and rode a lot more after that point. Another of the stories that you read about in American Siberia about this same railroad was there was a squatter who had built a store on what would become the railroad right-of-way. He didn't legally own the property. He had squatted on it. And so eventually, the railroad is building up to it. The guy says, hey, if you touch this store, if you try to get me out of here, I'm going to shoot you. So he's in a store. He's got a shotgun and rifles and stuff. He's ready to defend that store that he's built. So what Mr. Powell does is he and his convict labor build the railroad up to the store and then start back on the other side and keep going. But eventually, Mr. Powell said, he's told, you got to move that store. That building's got to be gone. So what he does is he basically takes all his convicts, He gets a bunch of logs, and let's see where I've got my notes to make sure I get it right. Yeah, surrounds with workers. He places it on logs. The gentleman and his staff is still in that building with shotguns threatening to shoot anybody that comes in. So they just don't go in. They just pick the house up, put it on logs, roll it out of the way. As you start rolling away, some of the ceiling boards start to fall in, so the guy finally rushes out and says, you know what, fine, move the thing. So Mr. Powell and his men, they move it, they drop it back down, nail the boards back up that fell down, and then go about their merry way finishing up the railroad. So just funny, lots of funny things in that book. Another gentleman related to talking about railroads, Thomas Dowling, born 1851 in Hamilton County, and he makes a fortune in lumber in the railroad business, not just in Suwannee County, but the surrounding areas. Operated a lumber mill in Lake City before he decided to move over to Suwannee County. Saw a lot of the timber holdings here in the county and realized, hey, there's some money to be made here, so he moved over here. And he established his businesses, large lumber mill and planing mill in Live Oak. Eventually that was cut out, so he went over to a place that at the time was called Hudson upon the Suwannee and built another sawmill and whatnot that later became Dowling Park. We'll talk about that more in the next couple of months. So you see him starting his businesses here in 1888, really. So at the tail end of this era we're looking at right now. August 27, 1887, Nancy Parsley, who is the widow of John Parsley we talked about before, she deeds 1 acre of property behind the First Baptist Church of Live Oak, deeds it to the school board for use as a public schoolhouse. And so the school board builds this structure. Actually, this is the structure after it had an addition done. But as far as I can tell, it's the first public high school first public school in Suwannee County. There may have been others, I just don't know about them yet, so that's why I'm prefacing it with that. But it was used as Suwannee High and the Suwannee School for a few decades. They're close to where the football field is now. Pretty much where it's located is, I think, the First Baptist Multi-Purpose Building, Family Life Center, I forget what it's called, but anyway, the back part of First Baptist Church. So it was used there for about 30 years. And then eventually, the school board decided they needed a bigger building, a better building, not a wooden building like this one. They needed something out of brick. And so they sold the building to the Florida Institute, that school for African American students. And it was moved over a couple blocks to the west to put it on the campus. Now this picture, and that was in 1916 when that happened, by the way. This picture I have seen for decades. And it always threw me off because it says Students for Memorial College. But I knew that to be the Suwannee High School. And so it's like, how did this come about? Well, I finally, several years ago, found newspaper articles from 1916 where the school board sold the building and had it moved to Florida Institute. So that's why you can see these Students for Memorial College, which did not become a college until 1918. You can see these students with that old building. It's the same building, just a different angle. That's the front of it on the right that we see here. Same building, the front part of the same building. So they moved it over a couple blocks to the Florida Institute campus, and it was used there for several decades. Part of it was the dormitories, part of it was something else I didn't write down, but it's in the newspaper articles from 1960 I was able to find. So that helped answer that question of what building is this, why is it listed as two different things? So that did help. Branford, aka Rollins Bluff originally. There had been a ferry at that location at least since 1858. So prior to the Civil War, there's a ferry in that location going over to Lafayette County, probably Rollins Bluff. I'm still working on that for the ferry names. But owned by a succession of folks. Well, by the 1870s, the Ivy family moves into the area. Robert Ivy and his brothers, J.C. and Jess. Jess and F.C. So not J.C., F.C. and Jess. Move into the area. So they build up this community name it, as we've already talked about, New Branford, which then later becomes Branford. And by 1885, there are about 350 people living in and around that community. They had an express and telegraph office by that point, 2 schools, a Methodist church, 5 general stores, a drugstore, several saw and grist mills, a hotel to accommodate steamboat passengers. And outside of Branford, there were also 7 turpentine mills, lots of cotton farms. So the community was incorporated in 1886 as New Branford, and it was actually on both sides of the river. So it was actually in Lafayette County. As the years progressed, the part on the west side, on the Lafayette County, became called West Branford. Then it kind of shriveled up and died. And the New Branford side of it, they changed the name, they dropped the new, and it became Branford. So that's how we have Branford as we know it. But with the steamboats, and especially after Robert Ivy came in, it was a major, as we've already talked about, a major stopping point for steamboats between Cedar Key and there. The railroad being built and completed in the 1880s allowed even better service to Branford and to Cedar Key. So this is a picture of one of the sawmills in Branford in either the late 1870s or possibly the 1880s, early 1880s. But you can see a lot of logs here in the river, but at that point it was wide enough you could still have those 150-foot steamboats we're talking about go up and down the river. Captain Robert Ivy. He was born in Georgia in 1847. He was one of nearly a dozen children of a Baptist minister by the name of William H. Ivy. William H. Ivy moved to Suwannee County and his family prior to the Civil War. They're listed in our first county census of 1860. He's listed as living here with his children. Well, Robert Ivy, Civil War starts. He's barely a teenager. He enlists anyway in the Confederate Army. And he serves for about a year before they realize how young he is. He's only like 13, 14. So they kick him out, saying you're too young. So he was briefly serving as a soldier when most kids are still playing with Barbie dolls, it seems. Most girls, probably not the boys, but anyway, he was young. My daughter's 13, so I guess I can't see her fighting in a war, but he did at that point briefly. So they moved further down into Suwannee County, moved to what's now Branford. They bought out that ferry that had been at Rollins Bluff, owned by a few different folks. And 1876, they were running that ferry. And then he established, as we've already talked about, the community of Branford. He also built several steamboats. We're going to have a few pictures of them in a minute. His most famous one was the Belle of Suwannee, but he built several others. C.D. Owens, named after one of the railroad folks that he knew. He had 2 of them named Suwannee with 1 N, and then the Belle of Suwannee with 2 N's. Very funny. He also had several others. Let's see, he had the hotel, and of course today there is a Riverside Park named after him. Some of his steamboats. We'll look at them. As far as we can tell, as far as I know anyway, his first steamboat that he built was called the Suwannee with 1 N. It shows up in records from 1889, had a length of 70 feet, width of 16.5 feet, a draw of 4 feet. So it's a smaller steamboat, easily navigating on the Suwannee River. There's confusion, like a lot of other things that far up back. There's confusion as to whether it's the same steamboat that he built. He built it in Branford in 1888 or so, or he took parts of another steamboat that had been wrecked and kind of refit and rebuilt it. Perhaps the Susie B was the name of it. And renovated her in Branford. So either she was built in Branford or renovated, reconstructed in Branford. We just don't know. But either way, by 1889, the end of 1889, he sold the Suwannee to interests that were further south, and she became a charter boat for many years. One of the folks that liked to ride aboard the Suwannee with 1 N was a guy you might have heard of by the name of Thomas Edison. Maybe heard of that guy. Well, the famous inventor wrote it, but then the Suwannee sank on Lake Okeechobee during the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926, that huge hurricane back then. So she sank in 1926. Well, in 1929, Thomas Edison's friend, Henry Ford, had her raised, part of her raised, salvaged the engines, some of the timber, whatever he could salvage from the steamboat after 3 years being underneath the water, and basically had a new steamboat built for his Greenfield Vintage and Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. So he had a new steamboat built with old parts from this steamboat, and 65 years she steamed around in a lagoon, permanently docked in 2004, and then scrapped in 2011. So this is the Suwannee on Lake Okeechobee, and bottom right is the museum in Michigan, after it had been rebuilt. So it doesn't even quite look the same. But it was called, the rebuilt part was also called Suwannee. So it's hard to tell. It's kind of the argument of sometimes when you talk about old ships, like the USS Constitution, there's probably not an original part left in her at this point. Is it still the same ship? That's one of those philosophical questions that are fun to talk about. Or if you take a screw from George Washington's flintlock gun and put it in a modern weapon, is it, it's kind of like that. So that's probably more like it was. Let's just take a few pieces off of her and build this different steamboat. So anyway, I'll leave that for philosophers another day. Another steamboat Captain Ivy built. This is the next Suwannee with one end that he built. She was 100 feet long, 24 feet wide, and either 4 or 5 feet draught, depending on who you look at. She was a scow hull vehicle or a vessel. She was basically used to dredge. So she was not a steamboat in the classical sense of she's going to be steaming up and down a river carrying passengers. No, she was built to dredge rivers, to make them more navigable for other steamboats. So she was owned by the Army Corps of Engineers, used on several different rivers. First off on the Suwannee River, look at some of the issues down in the channels. And then she was used on the Ocklawaha River and a few others, then sold in 1911 to the Hillsborough Dredging Company of Tampa. Only served for a few months before she burned and sank in Tampa Bay. Her machinery was salvaged, and then the wreck was dynamited in 1912. So the second Suwannee with one end that Ivy built, probably in Brantford. Another boat, Bella Suwannee, probably the most famous steamboat on the Suwannee River, built in 1889, December. 111 feet long, 24 feet wide. She was 180 tons, so a good size. Not the biggest on the river, but a pretty good size one. Bella Suwannee has that name because his favorite daughter, his only daughter, Bertha, was the belle of his eye, so he named the steamboat after her. Now, we'll talk about her probably in the next few months briefly. She would grow up, marry a guy named F.H. George, who was a doctor and became mayor of Brantford. So, and then she lived many years later. Let's see, Bella Suwannee was kind of famous for the time. She had a bridal suite, like a honeymoon suite, and she served catfish, which was a delicacy at the time. Go figure. Not to say I love catfish, but I mean, when you think of delicacies, catfish is not something that I personally think of. But then again, I didn't live 150 years ago. The Bella Suwannee transported people, obviously, but she also transported freight. And as time progressed and less people were using the steamboats, she transported freight more and more often. One of the runs that she and other steamboats would do would go up to Louisville to the home of Dr. Perry McIntosh, and basically had a home and an ice house. So they would bring blocks of ice from up north. It'd be dropped off at Cedar Key and then transported by steamboat up from Cedar Key on the Suwannee River. So you transport the ice that way. Let's see. Our most famous pilot was Dan McQueen, we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, she steamed without incident until the hurricane of 1896 hit this area very hard. Not just Suwannee County, but Taylor County and several counties in this area. Wiped out a lot of timber, wiped out a lot of buildings. Brantford lost most of their buildings, for instance. She was damaged. At one point, they thought she was lost because several steamboats were lost in the hurricane. and they could not find or hear from the steamboat, and so they thought Bella Suwannee had been sunk also. Well, she steamed eventually back to port under Dan McQueen. She had been damaged, but she lost basically all this up top. Her pilot house, her funnels were gone, but the bulk of her survived, so repaired her, put her back into service. But the economy had changed by that point, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the 1900s. But that destruction that was wrought by that hurricane of 1896, which happened in what year?
1896.
Good for you. They didn't name them back then. It was just a hurricane of whatever year, or the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926. So after that, the economy had been wiped out in a lot of this area. So a lot of the timber was blown down. A lot of people lost their livelihoods. Robert Ivy kind of got into some financial trouble. So he sold the steamboat and to a guy named Captain E.L. Magruder, which we'll talk about more at that time period. And he sailed her for a few years. Eventually she sank off of Cedar Key. Dan McQueen, the most famous pilot on the Suwannee River, as in riverboat pilot, like Mark Twain kind of concept. Dan McQueen was a mulatto, as in he was a mixed race, and he was born a slave, and born in 1860, but after the Civil War, as a he was still a teenager, he started serving aboard steamboats. First one was the Wawanock, which was the first one on the Suwannee River after the Civil War. He worked his way up, was a dishwasher, actually started at age 11. So he was not even a teenager, he was 11. As a dishwasher, worked his way up, learned the ropes, and by the 1880s, he was a steamboat pilot. He helped actually build the Bella Suwannee. So he helped Robert Ivy in 1889 build Bella Suwannee, piloted her, not just the Bella Suwannee, but several other steamboats. It was said, and this is amazing if it was true, but it was said that he knew every rock, every nook and cranny along the Suwannee, and he could navigate in the complete dark. He knew the river that well. He'd been on it so much. But, I mean, he did it all the time. 20, 30 years, it's possible that he did it. But he was not only a pilot, he also served as their master sometimes. And then in his spare time, he taught school in Old Town for the African American students. So he did lots of things. He actually outlived Robert Ivy, because I've got a copy of a letter that he wrote to the Ivy family after his death. So just, remembering the old times. So Dan McQueen, famous mulatto pilot. Ferries, we talked about them some last month. Ferries continue to operate on the Suwannee River at this point. We don't have really much in the way of bridges, other than the railroad bridges. And we have several ferries that have been around for decades, but also several others that are being established as more and more people move into Suwannee County and the surrounding areas. So let's see. Woods Ferry, run by Alan Woods at this point, upriver from Suwannee Springs. It's now part of, I think it's the Woods Ferry tract of Suwannee River Water Management. You've got Nobles Ferry Road going into Hamilton County between Suwannee Springs and the state park. You've got the ferry at the state park, which was run by people such as Charles Dean, A.C. Stevens, and John F. Sherwood in the 1870s. By 1889, it comes under the occupation or the control of a guy named W.R. Lee. And it was located in the Suwannee River State Park. You can actually see it. The ferry landing, even today, you walk over it on a bridge. So it's still there. And there was Horton's Ferry, run by John J. Horton at what's now Dowling Park. Established that in 1880. Urban's Ferry, we've already talked about, right? That's a picture of Urban's Ferry right there. Washington L. Urban established it by 1870s sometime. This is supposedly Washington Urban right here carrying the pole. And you see what they have. They've got a cable stretched across the river. And you just use that pole to kind of guide it using the water, the current to kind of move you. You hold it to the pole so you don't float away. So Urban's Ferry, you've got Grant's Ferry at Convict Springs, further downriver from this one. And then you've got Rollins Bluff Ferry, run by the Ivies I've already talked about. So pretty much in general, the laws, when you were allowed to operate a ferry, you had to pay license fee and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, there was not supposed to be a ferry within 5 miles of you. So every 5 miles, more or less, you can probably place a ferry as you look at the map. So these I'm talking about, boom, 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 boom. You can pretty much tell where they are. So those are some of those running just in the 1880s, late 1870s. Other communities are springing up in this era, including Lurville, named after Washington L. Irvin's daughter, Laura, not Lurville. Laura or Laura, depending on where you look. It was settled by 1878. By 1886, there was a population of 75 people. So that is downtown Lurville. In the 1890s, downtown as you want to call it anyway. Let's see. Laura, the namesake, when he established it, she was only like 5 years old, yes. Well, in 1888, 10 years later, she is at a school, a dormitory at that school, and it's Christmas, and she gets too close to a candle, and her dress catches on fire, and she is horribly burned. And so she is brought back to Lurville, where her uncle, Dr. Perry McIntosh, is, and he tries to nurse her back to health, but she succumbs to her injuries. So she dies at the age of 15, dies the next day, actually, on the 26th, day after Christmas. 15 years old. She is buried in the Ivy McIntosh Cemetery, which is in a community that used to exist called Riceville, which is a couple miles away from here. But that's where she's buried. That's where Irvin, Washington L. Irvin is buried. It's where a lot of the Ivies and the McIntoshes of that era are buried. So Lurville, one of the other folks who moved into that area was W.B. Telford. William B. Telford, who was a preacher. In 1864, he arrived there, and that's the name. And he owned the property of what's now Telford Springs. That's where that name comes from. Telford Springs, just outside of Lurville. Now, Lurville didn't have too much for it, except in the 1890s. We'll talk about probably next month more, because I got more pictures of it. But it briefly, in the 1890s, there was a rush of phosphate. Phosphate had been discovered in Central Florida and up here even in the Lurville area, and so people were buying it up left and right. And so briefly, Lurville was bigger than Live Oak. Briefly. But then it died down. They realized the phosphate was not the right kind, had too much iron content. But briefly, Lurville was bigger than Live Oak. At its heyday, Lurville had 4 stores, 2 churches, a blacksmith shop, a school, cotton gins, turpentine stills, and grist mills. And again, this is downtown Lurville. In the 1890s, the guy there's got a shotgun for some reason. Maybe Justice of the Peace or something. So, who knows? McAlpin, another community established during this period of the late 1870s and the 1880s. Named after Daniel McAlpin. He's circled there in the red. That's him over in Tallahassee. He was a representative. Now, he was also the early publisher, as I've already mentioned, of what became the Suwannee Democrat. Products, naval stores, cotton. By 1886, there was a population of 30 in McAlpin. All of 30 people. Another community established during the same period, and you will notice, if you don't already know, that these are along the railroads. As that railroad that we were talking about was being built, these communities were being established. So McAlpin's one of them being built. O'Brien is another one that is built on the railroad. You can see it here with the right-of-way. Right here's the railroad right-of-way in the middle of the community. It's spelled O'Brien, O-B-R-I-A-N. That's better than its initial spelling of O-B-R-I-N-E. O'Brien, like briny water, O'Brien. Well, the community was originally called Dobbs Hole after a sinkhole, which I've circled in red. You can see it if you have good glasses. You can see the little sinkhole drawn right there in, what is that, block 2, lot 4. That's Dobbs Hole that was talked about. Well, the railroad came through, they renamed it O'Brien after one of the railroad officials. Unfortunately, they spelled his name wrong because it was supposed to be spelled the way we currently have it today, O-B-R-I-E-N. So the story goes, they had built the railroad depot, they put the name of O'Brien on it, and that railroad official comes there and sees they misspelled his name. Kind of oops. So they eventually got it right. By the 1880s, 1890s, had 2 churches, a sawmill, turpentine still, cotton gins, and 5 stores, 2 churches, lots of other stuff. So that was O'Brien as platted in the 1880s. Lots of other communities. And here is a map from 1880. I believe it's 1880. 1891, excuse me, at the end of our discussion era. And you can see lots of little communities. There's Riceville and there's Lurville. I think Riceville is actually a little further to the west. So, lots of different communities. You've got Custer, you've got Grover up top, Hudson on the Suwannee, which is now Dowling Park. So a few of these communities, let's talk about them. Padlock or Padlock Station, right there, close to the railroad. Established 1873, named for the convict camp that was there. Padlocks on the places. C.K. Dutton, we've talked about him already. C.K. Dutton and Company, that was like the base of his operations for many years. Let's see, what else? Pine Mount. Pine Mount settled on the Savannah, Florida Railway, Savannah, Florida and Western Railway, 1883. Close to it, Pine Mount, right here, going south. 1886, had a population of 200, lumber, cotton, and vegetables were its main products. At its heyday, it had 3 stores, a steam-operated sawmill, a public school, and a Baptist church. Riceville, right here, north and west of Lurville, established before 1878, 2 miles or so from what became Lurville. It was named for the Honorable John W. Rice, who was a judge of the period. Rixford, which is up north of Live Oak, was named for George Rixford. He was a naval stores manufacturer, sawmill owner, grist mill owner, rice mill owner, cotton gin owner. He owned lots of stuff, in other words. Lots of property. Little River. Now this would be a different Little River than what we've talked about before, or will be talking about. Little River right there, south of Welborn. Established sometime around 1880. Principal products were cotton and vegetables. Little River, the other Little River was the one that we talked about several months ago, established by George McClellan, that would then basically be the Welborn area today. So 2 Little Rivers in Suwannee County's history. This community of Little River in 1886 had 75 people, 2 sawmills, a grist mill, and an academy, and it was famous for the honey peach. Let's see, Poplar, which was east of Ellaville. See if I can even find it on this map. It's not showing on that map. Poplar would be east of Ellaville, Suwannee River State Park today, up there. Was discussed in 1884. There was a traveler going through, but he said, hey, this place is not going to last because it's too far from the railroad, it's too far from the roads, it's not going to last. Well, it didn't last, so he was right. Let's see, Wilson. Wilson is within a few miles of O'Brien. It's not even showing on there. It'd be down here, probably about right here, between O'Brien and New Branford. It thrived in 1860 and 1890. There were more than 60 families that lived in that area in those years. Cattle, fruit, sheep markets. But you don't even see it on the 1891 map. There was also Cypress Lake, which was nearby at that time. And it was a 30-acre recreation area. So interesting stuff. Let's see. Yeah, in 1884, probably that same traveler I was talking about that went to Poplar and said, this place ain't gonna last. He said, Wilson has an opening for cotton gin, sawmills, and grist mills, and the community was thriving. Not terribly long, since it's not even showing up on this map. And this is ironic. The last time I did this presentation and got this far into it was 2018. So it didn't mean as much to me then as it does today, but in 1888, there was an outbreak of yellow fever, especially in Jacksonville and the surrounding areas. Yellow fever, something highly contagious, deadly. Jacksonville at the time had a population of 14,000. 1/3 of the population got it, and over 400 died that they know of from it. So, it's one of those things that was a little scary. There was a lot of hysteria that gripped the entire state. You know, wow, because Jackson was one of the big cities at the time. And you've got all these people coming down with it, and these people dying. And actually, that year, 1888, there was an election for governor, and even that was impacted because you had to, if you wanted to go from one county to the other, you basically had to wait 10 days to prove you didn't have yellow fever. So the candidates who were used to going from county to county couldn't even do that. So it made the election process a lot more difficult. I mean, it was bad though. We in Suwannee County were also impacted. And I've looked at the old records, the county commission minutes and the city council minutes. You see a lot of discussion. By August of 1888, the city of Live Oak basically starts quarantining anybody coming from Jacksonville. It's like, if you come from there, we got to quarantine you for a while. We're not going to take any more people. We're not going to take any goods from Jacksonville area. You just, from the east, forget it. We're not taking it. Law enforcement, they have to increase their law enforcement presence, hire more folks in town. They start implementing severe fines if you don't obey those laws. If you try to come in anyway, and you're from that area, they fine you. If you try to bring goods in, they fine you heavily. So that's in August of 1888. Within a few days, though, it's gotten so bad that law enforcement is boarding every train that's bringing people or goods. They're checking every people to make sure they have health certificates. Some of this starts sounding a little familiar, doesn't it? That's what I'm saying. It means so much more to me now, having gone through COVID. So they were inspecting for health certificates to make sure they were clear of yellow fever. The county set up quarantine camps here in Suwannee County to monitor cases. Again, we were not as bad as Jacksonville, but in Jacksonville, there was this belief, not just in Jacksonville, but everywhere, there was this belief that shooting guns in the air would somehow clear the air of the disease. And so at all hours of the day and night, you got people shooting guns. Well, that fad kind of died away. They realized maybe it doesn't mean anything because there was a doctor who was a big proponent of it. Well, he died from it anyway. So they figured maybe shooting the guns wasn't very good. They had other methods like burning barrels of tar, dousing trees, hitching posts, curbs, streetcars, etc., all that kind of stuff with disinfectants. They made it out of lime or mercury, just what you need. Yeah, they were disinfecting with lime and mercury. The city and the county minutes that I read through, you see a lot of people resigning. The mayor, city councilman, the chairman of the city council, they're resigning. Why? Well, because they're doctors and their services are needed to help provide for these folks that are coming in, these quarantine camps. So they say, we don't have time to work with business, the county or city business, we've got to deal with our patients. So a lot of these guys they resign and move on to helping those that are in these quarantine camps or those that are sick from it. The city and the county, they station people at railroad stops and at the borders. Basically, you're not coming in. We've got armed people at our borders in Suwannee County, stopping people from coming in because of this yellow fever outbreak. By October, there's no trains being let in. No trains are coming into Live Oak, Suwannee County. No passengers, no train crews, no other items for people until further notice. I mean, it's getting bad. Again, kind of weird after having lived through COVID. City council minutes state, quote, all parties who have been in contact with Mr. White need to be sent to the quarantine camp. Well, there are lots of whites. I don't know specifically which one. They did back then when they wrote the minutes, but I don't today. A lot of whites. They actually banned all religious and public gatherings until further notice. They dispersed them, said you can't do it. Man, sounds so familiar. But eventually, by December, the yellow fever epidemic in Florida and especially Jacksonville has died down. The city council starts allowing religious gatherings again, public gatherings, and some of those government officials who resigned, they returned to office and whatnot. So it kind of pretty much went back to everyday life. Other than paying those guards and the extra things, those camps, it pretty much returned to normal. Now the next year, the Florida Board of Health, the State Board of Health was established. So a lot of it has to do with that epidemic. They realized we've got to do something about it and have a more systematic way of watching out for this kind of stuff. It's very interesting. So the yellow fever outbreak. So that is the end of the 1870s and 1880s post-Reconstruction.